Taceria Flint was only 13 years old, but her hands bore the scars of a woman who had raised a family through fire. Ever since their mama died and their daddy disappeared into the bottom of a whiskey bottle, she had become everything to her two younger brothers: mother, father, protector, and provider. She learned to cook with what little she could trade for, taught herself to sew, and whispered prayers into the dark while the boys slept beside her on a shared straw mattress. She never asked for charity. She never complained. All she ever wanted was to keep her family together. But in the town of Witheridge, want and worth were measured in ink and coin, and Taceria had neither. That morning, the sun hung overhead like an unforgiving judge, high and blinding. The courthouse steps baked under the July heat, and the townspeople gathered not to help but to gawk, like they were watching a play instead of a child's life unraveling. Taceria stood in the middle of it all, clutching Bram and Jude against her as if sheer force of will could stop what was coming. Her voice cracked with desperation. "You can't take my brothers," she screamed, but no one moved, no one stepped forward. The black carriage rolled to a halt anyway, elegant and silent like death in velvet. Then came Eleanor Vale, the widow Vale. They called her, a woman wrapped in money and mystery. Her boots clicked sharp against the dirt, her blue traveling hat immaculate. She didn't look at Taceria, didn't even blink. With clinical grace, she opened her leather purse and pulled out a small velvet pouch. The sound of gold coins falling into the marshal's palm echoed like gunfire through the square. "That's gold," someone whispered. "Real gold?" The marshal looked pale, ashamed, but he nodded. Taceria's knees buckled. She dropped to the ground, dirt caking her palms as she clawed at the hem of the widow's dress. "Please," she begged. "They're my blood. I raised them myself. They're all I've got." The widow stepped back, expression blank, as if brushing away a leaf. "Not a desperate child. You're a child playing house," she said flatly. "I'm offering them food, shelter, a future." She turned to the boys. "Come." Bram shook his head violently, tears spilling down his sunken cheeks. Jude whimpered, burying his face in Taceria's back. She wrapped her arms tighter around them. "They won't go. They're not going." But the law had other plans. The marshal stepped forward, regret in his eyes, but not enough to stop him. "I'm sorry, Tess," he muttered. "There's nothing in the book saying you're their legal kin now. No deed, no papers, no property. You're just 13, and penniless." Eleanor added, her voice slicing through the silence. "What do you expect them to eat tomorrow?" Taceria looked around at the crowd, men and women who had once handed her bread or offered kind words when they thought it harmless. Now they stood still, eyes averted, their silence a betrayal louder than any shout. No one stepped in, not the baker who once gave her a stale roll, not the pastor who preached about compassion, not the seamstress who praised her mending, not even the judge who had watched her bring the boys to church every Sunday. When two townsmen pried the boys from her arms, Taceria didn't scream again. She simply collapsed. The weight of injustice crushed her, not just the loss of her brothers, but the humiliation of being deemed worthless. Not old enough, not rich enough, not legitimate enough to matter. She pounded the ground with her fists, the dust clouding her eyes, her mouth, her soul. The widow didn't look back as she walked away with the boys. The carriage door closed with a soft click. The crowd parted, swallowing her and the boys like a snake devouring innocence. And then there was silence. No gold coin had been placed in Taceria's hand, only shame. Taceria hadn't moved from the courthouse square. Hours had passed since they'd taken Bram and Jude, but she was still sitting there, cross-legged in the dust, arms wrapped around her knees like they were the last thing holding her together. Her dress was wrinkled and stained with tears and dirt. Her throat was raw, her eyes were dry, not because she'd stopped crying, but because she had run out of tears to give. The crowd was gone, the gold was gone, her brothers were gone, only the shame remained. And then she heard footsteps. Not heavy ones, not hurried, just slow, deliberate steps in worn boots. She didn't look up, not even when they stopped a few feet from her. But then a voice, low and even, broke the stillness. "Your brothers," he said. "You raised them yourself?" She gave the slightest nod, still staring ahead. "How long?" the voice asked again. Taceria's voice came out hoarse and brittle. "Since I was 10. Mama died. Pa disappeared into a bottle. I cooked. I kept them warm. I made sure they prayed. That's what counts, right? The man didn't speak for a moment. Then he sat down beside her. Long legs stretching out in the dirt. His hat pulled low over his brow. It was Calder. She'd seen him around, always on the edge of town. Quiet, alone, watching the world like it was a puzzle not worth solving. A rancher. Some said he'd been a soldier once. Others said he didn't speak unless he had something worth saying. He hadn't said anything when they took her brothers. Until now. They always listened to Gold. Taceria whispered. Calder reached into his coat and pulled out a folded slip of paper. You know how to read? She shook her head. He unfolded the page slowly. This here's a land deed, he said. It used to belong to a rancher with no family. I filed for it when he passed. It's mine now. Taceria frowned, confused. Why are you telling me? Calder looked at her, steady and clear. Because a deed matters. You were right. It's what makes things legal. I'm gonna use mine. Use it how? He stood and offered her his hand. You said they're your blood. You meant it. Then let's give you something legal to stand on. She stared at his hand. Calloused and firm. For a moment, she hesitated. Then, as if waking from a long nightmare, she took it. And for the first time that day, she didn't feel like someone who had lost. She felt like someone who might still have a fight to give. They left before dawn the next day. Taceria rode a borrowed mare beside Calder's larger, steadier horse. He hadn't told her much. Only that they were taking the land deed to Judge Alwyn, and that if things went the way he hoped, she wouldn't need to beg for her brothers anymore. I don't want charity, she said quietly as they rode. Calder didn't look at her. Ain't charity, it's law. When they arrived, the courthouse was still quiet. The judge wiping sleep from his beard as Calder placed the deed on the table. His voice was firm and plain as he explained what had happened. The boys were taken without her consent. This girl raised them, no paper to prove it. But I got land, and the law loves land. Judge Alwyn studied Taceria, his eyes unreadable. Your name? Taceria Flint. Age? 17. She lied without flinching. The judge rubbed his chin. The widow Vale paid in full. Technically fair. She's got standing. But they're not orphans. Calder said. They've got blood. No certificate. Maybe. But I've got a deed. I can name her ward, or wife. If she says yes. Taceria's head snapped toward him. Stunned. What? She breathed. Calder didn't blink. It's a paper world, Tess. We play by its rules. The judge raised an eyebrow. You're saying you'd marry her just to give her legal ground? I'm saying, Calder replied, that she raised those boys better than half the men I know. That ought to count for something. The silence that followed was thick as river mud. Taceria stared down at her boots. I don't want a husband out of pity. Calder's voice softened. I'm not offering pity. I'm offering a way forward. Judge Alwyn finally spoke. If she agrees, I can sign the papers. It won't stop the widow from contesting. But it gives you something real to stand on. Taceria stepped outside. The air suddenly too heavy. Her head spun. A day ago, she was nobody, just a girl who screamed into a deaf crowd. Now someone was offering her a piece of the law. A name. A fight. She didn't want marriage. She wanted her brothers. And Calder, he wasn't pushing. He wasn't demanding. He was just standing there. Calm. With space for her to decide. She walked back in and met the judge's eyes. Write it. Calder blinked once. That was all. No smile. No celebration. Just a nod. The pen scratched across the paper. The seal came down. And in that quiet room, something monumental shifted. Taceria was no longer a child begging in the dirt. She was someone the law had to recognize. The first morning back at the ranch wasn't quiet. It was alive. Roosters crowed like they hadn't in weeks. Startled by the sound of boots on floorboards and the laughter of boys chasing each other through the high grass. The wind tugged at the broken gate, whistling softly through the fence posts. Dust swirled, but it wasn't the kind that carried sorrow this time. It felt more like motion. Like breath returning to a place that had held itself too tightly for too long. Taceria stood barefoot in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up to her elbows, scrubbing the wooden counter until it gleamed beneath her rag. Her back ached. Her hands were raw, but she smiled as she worked. her heart strangely full. Every stroke of the cloth was a quiet act of defiance. A declaration. We are still here. In the front room, Calder knelt beside the wood stove, patching up an old cot. He'd already given her his bed without a word. Said it was too creaky for his back anyway. Now, with sleeves rolled up and a pencil tucked behind one ear, he muttered softly as he worked, measuring, tightening, sanding the legs. Abin, the younger of the boys, sat nearby with a wooden block and a pocketknife Calder had let him hold under supervision. He wasn't carving anything in particular, just copying the motions Calder made. Mimicry, like hope, came easy to children. Whitley, the elder, tugged on Taceria's dress from behind. Can I name the chicken with the white feathers? She turned, brushing a curl out of her face. Only if you promise to help feed her. He nodded solemnly. I'll be her best friend. Then her name's yours to choose. Stella, he declared, chest puffed. Taceria laughed, not because it was a silly name, but because it was the first time he'd smiled like that, not out of politeness or fear, but from something real. They spent the day putting the world back together piece by piece. Calder chopped wood and mended the chicken coop, his broad frame moving steadily under the afternoon sun. He didn't speak much, but Taceria was learning that he didn't need to. Every board nailed, every latch secured, every quiet look he gave her across the yard, it said more than words ever could. She sewed patches into the boys' worn clothes, humming under her breath. Her fingers were clumsy at first. It had been a long time since she'd held a needle with anything but urgency, but as she worked, the rhythm came back, not just to her hands, but to her breathing, her shoulders, her chest. It wasn't just clothes she was mending. It was memory. They cooked dinner together that evening, all four of them in the cramped kitchen like a strange little symphony. Calder boiled beans. Taceria fried up flatbread with lard and a sprinkle of salt. Abin was in charge of stirring, which he took very seriously, while Whitley set the table, placing mismatched plates and tin cups like they were made of gold. They ate by lantern light, knees bumping under the table, laughter slipping out in bursts. Calder passed Taceria the butter without being asked. Whitley told a joke about a horse that made no sense, but they all laughed anyway. Abin fell asleep with his head on the table, crumbs still on his cheek. Taceria carried him to the big bed, the only one that could fit them all, and tucked him in beside Whitley, who was already snoring softly. She sat at the edge of the mattress, watching them breathe. Later that night, she stood at the doorway, sipping tea from a chipped mug. The stars were out in full, clear and endless. She hadn't seen them like this in a long time. Not through a window, not behind a locked gate. She heard Calder's boots behind her. They sleep okay? He asked, like they hadn't in weeks. She replied, her voice soft. They talk in their sleep. About cold baths, about heavy books, about a woman with a mirror on her cane. Calder winced but didn't interrupt. Taceria took a slow breath. Was it legal, what we did? He leaned against the doorframe beside her. Maybe not perfect, but it was right. Sometimes, that's enough. She nodded, and for the first time in weeks, she believed it. The next morning was calmer, steadier, like the house had taken a breath overnight. Calder was already outside, oiling the hinges on the corral gate. Whitley and Abin chased a rooster through the yard, both barefoot and shrieking with delight. Taceria watched from the kitchen window, smiling as she stirred porridge over the stove. It wasn't much, it wasn't fancy, but it was theirs. She had known hunger, she had known grief, she had known what it was to be invisible in a room full of people. But now she knew this, the sound of boys laughing at breakfast, the creak of a chair where Calder always sat, the way sunlight made patterns on the wooden floor through clean windows. She was no longer just a sister fighting to hold on. She was building something, a home. That night, as the wind picked up and the lanterns flickered low, Abin padded out of the bedroom dragging his blanket behind him. He stood by Calder's cot for a long moment. Can I stay here? He whispered. Calder reached out, tugged the blanket up, and nodded. Only if you don't kick. Abin smiled and curled up beside him. From the doorway, Taceria watched, tea warming her palms. He needs a father, she murmured. I ain't much good with kids. Calder replied. He thinks you're a giant. I'm just tall. He's never had anyone tall on his side. Calder looked up at her then. Something deep and unreadable behind his eyes. You want me to be their father? She hesitated. I want someone who stays. He stood and walked toward her. Took the mug from her hands. Set it gently on the table. Then I'll stay, he said, if you'll let me. And for the first time since she'd screamed in the dust. Since the coins clinked in that marshal's palm. Since the boys were ripped from her arms. She let herself believe it. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were home. The wind was dry that morning, brushing over the prairie with a sharpness that hinted something was coming. Taceria had just finished feeding the hens with Aubin and Whitley when she saw it, the black buggy cresting the ridge. Its polished silver trim catching the sunlight like a blade. Her hands froze on the wooden gate, breath hitching in her throat. She knew that carriage, knew the woman inside it. And she knew this wasn't a visit born of kindness. Calder was in the field with the boys, showing them how to stretch and mark fence lines. His sleeves were rolled, a strip of leather tied around his wrist. Sweat glistening on his brow as he worked the post driver. Taceria glanced at him, then at the buggy again. Then straightened her back. She was not the girl on her knees in the dirt anymore. When the buggy stopped just beyond the porch, the door opened with its usual noiseless grace. And out stepped Eleanor Vale, the widow Vale, draped in her signature travel cloak, dark as ink and stiff with starch. Her presence sucked the warmth from the air. She held no gold this time, only a folded document in her gloved hand. Well, the widow said, her voice cool and deliberate. I thought I might find you hiding behind this broken old gate. Taceria didn't flinch. I'm not hiding, she replied. I'm raising the boys you left bleeding on the inside. The widow's eyes narrowed. I came with an offer. Not of money this time, but of finality. She held out the paper. Taceria took it with steady hands and unfolded it. The language was dense, legal, stamped, and notarized. It was an adoption certificate. The document said that if Taceria agreed to certain conditions, full custody would be hers. The seal of a distant judge gleamed in red wax. But beneath that promise, buried in careful phrasing, was the demand. She would get the boys if she left the West. If she disappeared east and never laid claim to this land again. No ranch, no future here, just silence and exile. Taceria's heart thudded in her chest. What condition? She asked, though she already knew. The widow's lips curled. That you leave this place behind. Take the boys. Yes, but vanish. You don't belong here. This land is mine. And your kind, loud, dirty girls with too much emotion and too little name don't last long in these hills. Taceria's hands trembled, but not with fear, with fury. Before she could speak, a voice rang out across the yard. She belongs more than you ever did. Calder was striding up the porch steps, wiping his hands on a cloth. His voice was quiet but edged with steel. This land don't remember coin, he said. It remembers hands that built it, voices that laughed on it, feet that danced in its dirt. Hers is already in the floorboards. The widow turned to him with a sharp sneer. And what would a ranch hand know of law? Calder stepped between her and Taceria, not shielding, just standing firm. Enough to know that paper don't matter if the boys don't choose her. As if summoned by fate, Whitley appeared at the screen door, dirt-streaked, holding his wooden horse. He paused when he saw the widow, his face clouding. Then he looked at Taceria. Mama? He said. The world stopped. Taceria's knees went weak. It was the first time he had called her that, the first time those two syllables had held more truth than a courtroom ever could. The widow's face paled. You've poisoned them, she hissed. No, Calder replied. They've been healed. The widow's hand shook as she reached for the paper in Taceria's hands. She tore it once, then again. The pieces fluttered down like dead leaves. You'll regret this, she whispered. No, Taceria said, voice steady now. I already lived the regret. You gave me nothing to fear. The widow didn't respond. She simply turned, climbed into her buggy, and disappeared into the wind like smoke from a snuffed candle. After the dust settled, Taceria dropped into the porch rocking chair, her chest rising and falling with everything she hadn't let herself feel until that moment. Calder didn't speak. He just stood beside her, grounding her with his presence. Whitley climbed into her lap, his arms winding around her waist like they belonged there, because they did. You really would have left it all. She murmured. All this, for them. Calder nodded slowly. If that's what it took. But it shouldn't have to. She looked at him, not with gratitude, but with something deeper. Why? He didn't answer. Not directly. Just knelt down, brushing dust off her hem. And said, because someone should have stood for you a long time ago. Inside, Abin was humming a lullaby Taceria used to sing during the hard winters. The melody drifted out through the screen door. Soft and steady. She listened to it for a long moment before she said, I'm not leaving this place. Calder smiled. Good, because neither am I. That night, as the boys slept in the bed that now truly belonged to them, Taceria sat alone at the little writing desk near the window. The rain hadn't come yet, but the wind was shifting, and the sky had turned to a deep, expectant violet. She opened the drawer and found the torn pieces of the adoption offer. She didn't burn them, not yet. She folded them, set them in a box, and locked it, not out of bitterness, but to remind herself what she'd refused. She had chosen love, not control. She had chosen her voice over someone else's idea of a future. She had chosen home, and this time, no one could take it from her. The morning sun poured through the window like spilled honey, brushing golden light across the wooden floor of the little ranch house. 4 pairs of boots sat by the door, one too large, 2 small and scuffed, and 1 pair that still seemed too new for the dust of this land. And yet, they all belonged there now. Taceria stirred porridge on the stove, her hair pinned back, her sleeves rolled, her bare feet steady on the worn floorboards. She glanced over her shoulder as Whitley and Abin argued good-naturedly at the table over who had caught more rain in their mouths the night before. Their cheeks were flushed, their eyes bright. They were laughing, freely, loudly, like boys should. Calder sat by the hearth, mending a worn fence strap, as if he had always been there. It wasn't a grand morning. There were no parades, no witnesses, but in its stillness was something sacred, a kind of everyday holiness that Taceria had never known could exist. It was peace. It was home. When she turned back to the pot, she caught Calder watching her. Not staring, just watching. The way someone might watch a sunrise they never expected to see. There was something in his eyes. Something quiet and steady and terrifyingly sure. She met his gaze, heart fluttering. There's something I've been thinking, he said, voice low, rough like the worn edges of an old saddle. She stopped stirring. I figured I'd wait, but the truth is, I don't want to wait. He nodded slightly toward the boys. They're yours, always were, but now they're mine too, if you'll let them be. Whitley looked up, spoon halfway to his mouth. Abin dropped his cup, and Taceria just stood there, still, stunned, heart pounding in her chest. I'm not rich, Calder continued, and I sure as sin ain't perfect. But this house could use a wife. These boys deserve a mother who doesn't just survive, but shines. Her lips parted, but she couldn't speak. Not yet. I don't need an answer now. He added gently, you'll find a ring on the windowsill by sundown. You pick it up, you put it on, that's your yes. You leave it there, and nothing changes. I'll still be here. I'm not going anywhere. And then, as casually as if he'd offered her coffee, he returned to his mending. She didn't cry. Not this time. She just smiled, slow, astonished, and whispered, then you'd better make it a good ring. Calder. That evening, after supper and chores, and after the boys had curled up on the rug beside the fire with full bellies and dirt under their fingernails, Taceria stepped out onto the porch alone. The storm had left behind a scent of life, wet earth. Honeysuckle, wood smoke. She breathed it in like a promise. There on the windowsill, in the last light of day, lay the ring. It wasn't big or shiny. Just a simple silver band, worn and carved with something soft and old and unreadable. But it was real, and it had waited for her. Her hand didn't shake as she picked it up. She turned it over in her palm, then slipped it on. It fit like it had been meant for her all along. You can't take my brothers, she whispered into the wind. Not anymore. And the wind, warm and soft and certain, seemed to whisper back, you never had to ask again. The next days settled into something like rhythm, like family. Taceria rose before the boys and stood barefoot on the porch, her nightdress brushing her calves as Calder handed her coffee. They didn't need many words anymore. The quiet between them was no longer awkward, it was rich. Alive. Comforting. The boys began to call her Mama without flinching. Sometimes they forgot there was ever a time they hadn't. Abin would drag his blanket to Calder's cot and curl up without question. And Calder, rough, quiet Calder, would simply tug it into place and rest a protective hand on the boy's back until he slept. They weren't perfect days. The hens still squawked too loud. The stove still needed coaxing. The water pump still squeaked. But they were theirs. And in the little imperfections, Taceria found herself. She wasn't just a girl with a loud voice and too many brothers. She wasn't a burden. She wasn't forgotten. She was a mother. She was a woman. And maybe, just maybe, she was beloved. One afternoon, while sweeping the porch, she paused and looked out across the fields. The boys were racing sticks across the creek like boats. Calder was bent low, fixing the fence again, his dog trotting loyally beside him. The sunlight caught in his hair, and he turned just enough to catch her watching. He tipped his hat, and that was all. She clutched the broom handle with both hands and smiled until her cheeks hurt. There had been a time when she would have sold her soul for one person to choose her, just once. Now she was surrounded by people who chose her every day. And more importantly, people she had chosen back. That night, as she laid down between the boys in their shared bed, with the smell of warm cotton and soap lingering on their hair, she whispered a prayer into the dark. Not the desperate, begging kind she used to say as a child, but the quiet kind, the kind you only say when you're no longer lost. Thank you, she whispered to the ceiling, for letting me stay, for letting me belong. And outside, the prairie wind hummed its answer in the night.